All right, good afternoon, everyone. And thanks for joining us this afternoon. Thanks to our friends, colleagues, and family members online who are also joining us at this hour, wherever you're joining us from. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. So first, I would like to begin with a note of gratitude, as we always do, to those who continue to support the presence of our UMAPS scholars on our campus. Office of the President, the Provost Office, the International Institute, the Department of Afro-American and African Studies, Center for Global Health Equity, Center for International Reproductive Health Rights, and our faculty host and collaborators. So I would also like to thank the families of our scholars who let us borrow them for an entire semester. It is not easy to leave your family behind and be away in a strange land, sort of. So thanks also to their respective universities for lending them to us this semester. So I know many of them are away from their teaching assignments at their universities, and their students are also missing them. So today we have three excellent scholars who will be sharing their work with us. I will introduce them shortly. Once they are introduced, each of them will come forward to present in the order in which they are introduced. At the end of the presentation, we will have a Q&A. For our Zoom audience, please type your questions and we'll read them out to our presenters. And if you would like to chime in, Zoom audience, use the raise hand icon on Zoom to indicate that you want to ask your question directly rather than typing it. So once again, thank you and welcome. So our first scholar today is Dr. Jude Okoye. Dr. Jude Ogechukwu Okoye is a lecturer in the Department of Medical Laboratory Science at the Nnamdi Azikiwe University, Nigeria. He recently completed his PhD at the same institution, focusing on oncogenes and tumor suppressor genes in the human papillomavirus, Epstein-Barr virus, and herpes simplex virus type 2 among female sex workers. He is a recipient of the 2021 Merck Foundation Best Young African Researcher Award and the 2022 American Association for Cancer Research Global Scholar in Training Award. At Michigan, he is collaborating with Professor Yatrik Shah of the medical school. And thanks, Professor Shah, for coming. And they are collaborating on a project that evaluates clinical and therapeutic implications of race-linked genomic and gut microbiome variations and interactions of metastatic colon cancer. His presentation this afternoon is titled Signatures of High Mortality Risk and Lifestyle Practices Among Patients Diagnosed with Colorectal Cancer in Nigeria. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Okoye. Next is Dr. Tshepiso Scott. Dr. Scott is a lecturer at the Faculty of Law, University of Pretoria, South Africa. She holds an LLB and LLM from the University of Pretoria and an LLD from the University of South Africa. Her research interest centers on consumer protection law and company law in South Africa. Dr. Scott is being hosted by Professor Kyle Logue of the law school, and they're working on improving consumer access to redress in South Africa. But Dr. Scott's presentation this afternoon is titled Small Enterprises in South Africa. Is their protection as consumers warranted? Please join me in welcoming Dr. Scott. Finally, Ms. Eyerusaleam Kassahun. Ms. Eyerusaleam Kassahun is a lecturer in the School of Theatre Arts at Addis Ababa University, Ethiopia, from where she also holds an MA degree. She has written and produced short and feature-length films and stage plays, and we are actually planning to see one of her feature films soon. Academic interests include decentralizing the diverse spectrum of Ethiopian cinema and theater, with emphasis on issues stemming from Ethiopia's relationship with Black population in Africa and the diaspora. While at Michigan, she's collaborating with Professor Frida Ekoto of the Department of African Studies and Romance Languages and Literature on a project aimed at retheorizing colonialism through Ethiopian theater project. So thanks, Professor Ekoto, for joining us. Eyerusaleam's presentation this afternoon is titled Decolonizing the National Theater of Ethiopia. Please join me in welcoming So each of our presenters will have 15 minutes to present their work, at the end of which we'll have a Q&A. So please welcome Dr. Jude Okoye.
Good afternoon and good evening wherever you are. Presentation. So my name is Jude Okoye. I'm a visiting scholar in the Department of Molecular and Integrative Physiology here in Michigan. I am hosted by an amazing mentor here, Professor Yatrick Shah. So today I'll be presenting a paper titled The Signatures of High Mortality Risks and Lifestyle Practices Among Patients Diagnosed with Colorectal Cancer here at Nnamdi Azikiwe University Teaching Hospital. So I usually like to describe what cancer is before proceeding to the main stuff. And I like to describe cancer as militant cells or crazy cells. But in the formal way, you could describe describe as a disease or condition that is associated with uncontrolled proliferation of cells. These cells can migrate to distant organs, can invade nearby tissues, and mop up the nutrients in that place. And that is why cancer patients are usually characterized by anemia, asthenia, and anorexia. So this is just the cancer cells, and this proliferation, uncontrolled proliferation of these cells can arise as a result of mutation and also infections. So we reviewed cancer statistics in 2020, and we observed that the age standardized incidence rate in the United Kingdom, in the United States, is quite or 2 times higher than the values reported in West Africa, especially for breast cancer, prostate cancer, and colon cancer. But I want to add here that the age standardized incidence rate against the new cases diagnosed is quite higher in West Africa compared to these 2 different regions. The reason for this we do not know, but if you look at our findings or our data from 2016 to 2022, you could observe that the mortality rate is beginning to rise. And I can tell you here that the 4 years or even 5 years survival rate among our patients is just 4.8%. In 2022, the survival rates of the cancer patients in the United States increased by 12%, but we can't say that for Africa. We even believe that the values are beginning to even drop as things change. So before I talk about this early onset colorectal cancer, many factors have been attributed to the development of colorectal cancer. And one of those factors is the westernization of African diet. We also believe that changes in lifestyle may also attribute or increase the risk of an individual developing colorectal cancer. And by the way, colorectal cancer does not just appear, it develops over a period of time. In my country, a lot of people come down with the disease thinking that they have peptic ulcer, but they do have colorectal cancer. And they spend a lot of time, trying to find solutions to the peptic ulcer before, without knowing that their disease is getting to the late stages. So Halowati et al. Reported a higher prevalence rate of early onset colorectal cancer among Nigerians, particularly those in northern Nigeria. I am from the northern and southern Nigeria. So they reported that the prevalence of early onset colorectal cancer is twice higher in Nigerians compared to their African American counterparts. They also stated that Nigerians are 8 times likely to be diagnosed, or more likely to be diagnosed of rectal cancer compared with the African Americans. The reason for this, we do not know, but their recent paper published last month shows that people, non-Hispanic blacks with early onset colorectal cancer had higher mutation rates compared with their Asian Pacific Islander counterparts and those non-Hispanic whites. So in our study, one of the studies we carried out in the past showed that our patient had 25% of our patients had mutations in their BRCA2 gene. And BRCA2 gene is less frequently mutated than BRCA1 gene. So if we are having these, which is less frequently mutated in this high percentage, that means we may have other mutations that we do not know about. So we aim to identify the risk factors for colorectal cancer-related mortality and chemoresistance. We will see why we are talking about chemoresistance in a few slides coming up. So we also want to evaluate the socio-clinical demographics among our patients. We want to also identify hematological indices that could be used to identify individuals at risk of mortality. And then we intend to differentiate the right-sided colon cancer and left-sided colon cancer by the mutation rates. I would like to add here that right-sided colon cancer is quite aggressive compared to the left-sided colon cancer. So we also want to look at the mutations that are associated with metastases and chemoresistance, and also we want to determine the role of gut microbiome in the development of right-sided metastatic and chemoresistant colorectal cancer. So looking at the social demographic factor, you will see that females are, the colorectal cancer prevalence is higher among females, especially those who are under 50 compared with their counterparts. So we do not know the factors that are responsible for this, but we intend to find out. And we also observed that individuals with, who are under 50 years had more percentage of right-sided colon cancer compared with those who are under 50. So we also found out that people who are under 50 had more rectal cancer compared with their counterparts who are above the age of 50. We also saw that those individuals patients who were above the age of 50 years had more metastatic tumors compared with their counterparts under the age of 50. I would like to move forward. We shall see some of these things as we proceed. But I would like to also state that only 14% of our patients 14.6% of our patients received the full course of chemotherapy. And out of these individuals, 1 in 4 of the individuals that received full course of chemotherapy were resistant to the drugs that we administer. The reason for this, we do not know. So we also evaluated the time of symptom manifestation to time of presentation at the clinic, and we observed that majority of our patients reported at the clinic after 6 months of symptom development. So we believe that time of presentation at the hospital may affect the risk of mortality. So we observed that those who are above the age of 50 presented at the clinic within the 6 months of symptom manifestation. How this impacts the outcome of treatment, we will see in the coming slides. We looked at, we evaluated the survival probability among females and males in our study, and we observed that females lived longer than the males, despite the fact that they had higher prevalence of the disease. The reason, we do not know. Why men had to die early, we do not know, despite the fact that we are nice, we open the doors, we give flowers to our ladies, but we kick the buckets early. So we need to find out why and probably, rectify that. So we observed that those with hypertension also died earlier compared with those without the hypertension. And then those who consume tobacco and alcohol, as we have among our population here as well, they lived shorter than those who who do not consume tobacco or alcohol. So if you're consuming tobacco or alcohol, be mindful of the amount you take. So as expected, those who had metastatic tumors died earlier compared with those without the metastases, and those who received surgery, especially those their tumors are operable, lived longer than those who had no surgery. As expected also, those who received chemotherapy lived longer than those who did not, and the effect of chemotherapy was significant. We also looked at herbal concussion. Contrary to our hypothesis, we thought that people who consume herbal concussion would, die early than those who did not. But here we could see at some point that those who consumed this herbal concussion lived longer than those who did not. But looking at the end, you will see that they eventually died earlier. But the reason for this, we do not know. But we believe that maybe the herbal concussion had little effect. We are not saying that we are promoting herbal concussion consumption, but we are saying that we need to standardize what we have in our region to help our patients. Because this cancer chemotherapy that we have in our society is quite expensive, and most patients can't afford it. Their insurance may not be available enough to cover the expense. So we looked at the survival probability among those who are presented at the clinic within 6 months of symptom development, and we saw that they lived longer compared with their counterparts who presented after 6 months and after 1 year. But the difference or the significance is not that significant. So time of presentation at the clinic cannot be used as an independent predictor of mortality rate. So we also classified our patients based on herbal concussion naive, herbal concussion experience. So we did the comparison for chemo naive and chemo experience, and also we classified our patients based on their condition when they left the hospital. Some of our patients died in the hospital, some left the hospital in stable condition, some were discharged against medical advice. So we looked at the time of presentation at the clinic, and we saw that those who were discharged in stable condition presented at the clinic even higher at a later time. Those who died in the hospital presented at the clinic early enough than this individual. So some other factor may be playing a role in the death of these individuals. So we looked at some hematological indices to help us identify those who are at risk of dying, and also to identify those that need aggressive treatment. Because if you know those who require this treatment, you give them all they need to survive. But if you do not know those who require aggressive treatment, by the time you recognize that they need that, they may already be in the grave. So we evaluated this, and we saw that those who experienced herbal concussion, or who took herbal concussion, had lower neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio and platelet to lymphocyte ratio. We also saw that the same difference in those who consumed chemotherapy, or those who received chemotherapy against chemotherapy naive individuals. Looking at those who were stable on discharge, you will see that these values were lower compared with those who died in the hospital. So this parameter could be used to identify individuals who are at risk of dying, especially in the primary health care centers that does not have or do not have the facility to, take care of these patients. We also saw these similar trends when we looked at the neutrophil to lymphocyte platelet ratio and also the platelet neutrophil lymphocyte ratio. Those who were stable on discharge had lower values of these parameters compared with those who died in the hospital. So we could also use this. The thing here is that we are also experiencing the same effect of this chemotherapy, just as in those who received the herbal concussion. So our herbal concussion may be working, so we cannot just throw away what we have in our environment for what we do not have or what is too expensive for us to, get. So our next step is to assess the differential mutation between the right-sided and left-sided colorectal cancer and to colon cancer to identify why our patients, why these right-sided ones are quite aggressive compared to the others. And then we are also going to look at the mutations associated with metastasis and chemoresistance, and then the gut microbiome relationship with resistant and right-sided and metastatic colon cancer. So I want to thank the African Studies Center for making my stay here possible. And I also want to thank my professor, Patrick Shah, who is quite great. He's a great mentor, and I think everyone will want to study under him or maybe be mentored by him if the person wants to go far. So I also want to thank the lab, my lab mates or friends, and also Professor Nriago, Emeritus Professor Nriago, who is just behind there. He's from here as well. He's from Nigeria, but he was a faculty member here before he retired. And also want to thank my fellow UMAPS scholars, especially James Owa, who helped me or assisted me in carrying out the statistical analysis. Here, I also want to tell my African people that the help we need sometimes we can find among us. You just need to ask. So this is my colleagues. We provide free medical care back in Africa to rural communities. We go down, especially those who do not have the facilities in their community. And these are the children that I mentor. I help, coordinate their educational growth. And then this is my family. So thank you very much for listening.
That was nice. Thank you. Next is Dr. Tshepiso Scott.
Yes, Prof. Thank you. Mike. For those who are joining online, thank you for joining as well. Today I'll be presenting my comparative research that I've conducted on the protection of small enterprises as consumers in terms of South Africa's consumer protection legislation. I will try my best to distill this information into the 15 minutes that has been provided and address anything or any gaps in the Q&A session that we'll have at the end of the session. I think I also want to just start off with my acknowledgements in case I run out of time. So I would like to start off by acknowledging my host, Professor Kyle Logg, who has given me a lot of very meaningful, substantive comments on my paper and is unfortunately not able to join us today. I'd also like to thank Professor Chris Feek for her comments, the language and editorial comments that she's provided on the initial draft of my paper as well. I'd like to thank the law school research scholars who have also provided their feedback on my paper, which I am still in the process of processing and incorporating into my final product. And of course, I would like to thank the ASC for the opportunity to be here and to present my research to everyone who is here today. So, to contextualize my presentation, I would like to start off with speaking or looking at the rationale that we have behind consumer protection legislation. On the slide, you'll see that we have two images. The first image is an image of a giant money-made human that is fully dressed and towering over a much smaller human who is undressed and only has a single note of money in his hand. His or her or their hand. So what we can note here is that this image is seeking to represent something that exists in consumer-supplier relationships, and that is an unequal bargaining position that often exists when you have a consumer dealing with a supplier. That is one of the first rationales that we have behind actually having consumer protection legislation. The second image is a word cloud that highlights the words information asymmetry. Information asymmetry is the second rationale behind having consumer protection legislation. And in essence, information asymmetry alludes to a situation where there is unequal access to information or knowledge in the supplier-consumer relationship as well. And that is something that consumer protection seeks to address. It seeks to firstly address the issue of equalizing the bargaining position of the parties, but also ensuring that both of the parties are very aware of what their rights, responsibilities, and remedies in any given situation is. Now, there have been some tensions that existed prior to the inclusion of a solid consumer protection statute in South Africa. There was some resistance to the incorporation of consumer protection legislation. So on the one hand, we had the self-reliance approach, which essentially encompasses contractual freedom, party autonomy, as well as sanctity of contracts. This is contrasted against the other philosophy of a more social and interventionist approach, which realizes that there isn't always fairness in contractual arrangements, and sometimes the law needs to intervene in order to introduce this fairness into a contractual arrangement that exists where there are parties who might be considered as being vulnerable. And oftentimes consumers would be considered as being the vulnerable party in such a relationship. Whilst the opponents of consumer protection would argue that the introduction of fairness into contracts would disrupt efficiency in decision makings and even possibly increase the cost that would be passed down to consumers inevitably, a contrary view is allowing the market to operate completely as a free market would have an effect of having an even greater risk to consumers, risk in the form of having goods that are of a lower quality and potentially even dangerous that the consumers might receive, which would actually, I would submit, make those costs or those inefficiencies justifiable in order to protect or lessen the risk insofar as the consumer is concerned. So the Consumer Protection Act has now introduced fairness into commercial arrangements that involve consumers, and this fairness has been introduced at both a substantive and a procedural level. Now, small enterprises form the backbones of many economies. They play an important role through their contribution towards economic growth and sustainable development. And in developing countries in particular, they can play a very important role in terms of poverty eradication as well as economic transformation. In South Africa, they currently contribute 35% towards our total GDP. And by 2024, the goal is for small enterprises to actually contribute 50% towards our GDP. And 2024 is in 9 months, by the way. So that's a lot of pressure on small enterprises to make a significant contribution to our GDP. However, regardless of the fact that there's so much hope put into small enterprises face a number of threats, and these threats actually pose a risk to their continued existence. Reasons for their threatened survival can span from a lack of sufficient resources, and these can be financial or non-financial resources, to a general ignorance of the regulatory framework that influences how the small enterprise operates. In my paper, I provide an example of a small baking enterprise that operates in rural South Africa. I illustrate that if this baking enterprise were to purchase flour, but it were unable to use this flour because the flour was either contaminated or had expired, that small baking enterprise could be placed in a very difficult position if the supplier were to refuse to take back that baking flour. In fact, if that small enterprise had decided to buy flour for the entire month's operations, that single inability for the small enterprise to bargain with the supplier can have detrimental consequences on the continued existence of the small enterprise. So that's just to put into perspective how detrimental and big the impact of not assisting small enterprises in this regard can be. The key legislation I look at in my paper is the Consumer Protection Act, which I will refer to as the CPA, as well as the National Small Enterprise Act, which I will refer to as the NSEA. Now, the NSEA sets out what I've called the national standard for small enterprises. The essence of the definition of a small enterprise in terms of the NSEA is an enterprise that is a separate and distinct business entity and one that is classified into a micro, small, or medium-sized enterprise. So what is immediately evident from the definition of a small enterprise that is provided for by the NSEA is that it appears to restrict the application of, or the scope of application of the NSEA to incorporated small enterprises. And secondly, it seems to accord a wider meaning to the term small enterprise by dividing it into three subcategories of small, micro, and medium-sized enterprises. The first observation that I've highlighted can be deduced from the description of a small enterprise as one that is separate and distinct, which alludes to a separate legal persona. In the South African context, when the legislature intends to include natural persons within the scope of small enterprises, it usually does so expressly. And we can see this from legislation such as the Income Tax Act that we have in South Africa. The current inferred meaning of this definition appears to completely ignore the existence of unincorporated small enterprises, which would refer to enterprises such as sole proprietorships, and these are enterprises that form a huge part of the informal economy in South Africa, which is somewhat problematic. However, the definition is still useful for the submissions that I make later on in my paper regarding the thresholds that need to be revisited in South Africa. So the definition and the thresholds that I'm referring to here are the ones that are post the 2004 amendments to the NSEA. For purposes of the South African Consumer Protection Act, a consumer is a person to whom goods or services are marketed, a person who enters into a transaction, a person who is a recipient or a beneficiary of a transaction, regardless of whether they are actually a party to the transaction itself, as well as franchisees. Persons in the CPA are also defined to include juristic persons, but in order for the CPA to apply to a juristic person as a consumer, that juristic person needs to have an annual turnover or a total asset value of less than 2 million rand. Prior to the 2004 amendments, a number of micro-enterprises would have been protected as consumers within the scope of the CPA because the initial numbers under the previous NSEA were such that a micro-enterprise needed to have an annual turnover of 150,000 rand or an asset value of 100,000 rand. However, after the amendment of the NSEA, there now seems to be a gap because the lowest threshold for a micro-enterprise currently sits at 5 million rand. Therefore, there are a number of micro-enterprises that fall within the 2 million to the 5 million bracket that are still considered to be significantly smaller enterprises in the current South African context, but are not afforded the protection of the Consumer Protection Act. Notably, these threshold requirements do not apply where you are dealing with a franchisee. So what we can note in terms of the protection of the CPA in respect of the small enterprises is that natural persons are protected without restrictions, juristic persons are protected to the extent that they fall within this threshold, and franchisees are protected also without restriction, although there are certain provisions in the CPA that expressly do not apply to franchisees. So, I'm going to try go through this very fast because Teye is being an enemy of progress, but it's okay. Okay, so for purposes of my comparative component, I started off by looking at the UN Consumer Protection Guidelines. Essentially, what the UN Consumer Protections Guideline provide is that a person who is a consumer is a natural person who is acting primarily for personal, family, or household purposes. So it doesn't apply to small enterprises very clearly, but this definition of a consumer under the guidelines also allows member states to make specific adjustments according to their domestic needs. I looked at 3 jurisdictions for purposes of my comparative analysis. The first was the USA. In terms of the USA, the definition that is provided for a for a consumer is an individual acting primarily for personal, family, or household purposes. The Michigan Consumer Protection Act doesn't specifically make reference to a definition for consumer, but the term that's often used when they are trying to, when the U.S. courts in Michigan are trying to consider whether a business can sue under the Michigan Consumer Protection Act is the definition of trade and commerce. This is defined as conduct of a business providing goods or services primarily for personal, family, or household purposes, and it doesn't apply to franchise agreements. So unlike the South African context, franchisees don't fall within the scope of the consumer protection legislation in the US, and that personal, family, or household requirement somehow echoes the standard that was set out by the UN guidelines on consumer protection. Now, there are a number of cases that have addressed this contentious point on whether businesses can sue under the MCPA. I would have loved to talk you through the facts, but the short answer is that initially there was a finding that yes, they could, but there have been other decisions that came that rebutted the logic that small businesses can sue under the MCPA, and the most recent decision being the FOMCO case follows this similar logic that a enterprise or a business can't directly just sue under the MCPA unless there is an underlying transaction that proves that personal purpose requirement and the business itself has standing under the provisions of the MCPA. So essentially, the position appears to be in the US that as a business, you can't just ordinarily sue under the provisions of the MCPA. The Indian Consumer Protection Act defines a consumer as a person who buys goods or services, but it excludes purchase of goods or services where it is for resale purposes or where it is for a commercial purpose. The explanatory notes to the Indian Consumer Protection Act includes that commercial purpose doesn't include where someone is trying to create a livelihood. So it won't include instances of self-employment. Possibly a lot of sole proprietorships also won't be included, meaning that they would be protected as consumers in terms of the provisions of the Indian Consumer Protection Act. Where the transaction falls outside the provisions of the Indian Consumer Protection Act, then the business would have to have recourse to the Sale of Goods Act, which is a business-to-business legislation. Then lastly, in terms of the UK, the CRA defines a consumer as an individual who is acting wholly or mainly outside of their trade, business, or profession. Therefore, the intention of the legislature in terms of the UK CRA seems quite clearly to be that a person cannot be acting for business or work-related purposes if they seek to be protected under the scope of the CRA. However, there is an act called the Enterprise Act in the UK that seeks to promote enterprise and economic growth. The Enterprise Act does make provisions or make specific reference to small enterprises, and it even has a small business commissioner that is there to ensure that small enterprises are provided with a level of guidance when they are entering into transactions with their larger counterparts. Once again, where the transaction doesn't fall within the scope of the Enterprise Act, they would need to have recourse in terms of the Sale of Goods Act. So, in concluding, to answer my question, that I posed at the beginning of this presentation, the answer to that question would be that yes, small enterprises in the South African context should be protected as consumers. However, it would be necessary to make adjustments to the threshold that is currently applicable so that it can at least protect those who are considered to be micro enterprises as well as small enterprises. My argument in this paper is also that the threshold that applies to juristic persons should be across the board to include franchisees as well, as there's no reason why a large juristic person that is operating as a franchisee should benefit from the protection of the CPA, as that is simply contrary to the purpose of consumer protection legislation. There is no inequality of bargaining power, and there's no information asymmetry in such an instance. Then lastly, the last recommendation or finding that I'd like to highlight is that a separate regulatory framework or regime to subsidize or protect small enterprises with the same rights that are afforded to consumers would be an unnecessary duplication of resources in the South African context. This is particularly so when the complaints and the protections that are sought by small enterprises fall fundamentally within the realm of consumer protection legislation and can be addressed through the existing infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next is Eyerusaleam. Is this okay for you?
Someone could, yeah. What is the point? So thank you so much. Hi, everyone. And thank you so much, Professor, for your kind introduction. So as you can see from the PowerPoint, my talk will be decoloniality of theater by giving special emphasis or by taking the Ethiopia's national theater as an example. But before going into the details of my presentation, I would like to start it by playing a very short video. So this exception was Ethiopian victory over the White Army. So in 1896, Ethiopia defeated an Italian army at the Battle of Adwa and secured its sovereignty. So this non-colonial nation, as an independent nation, held a special position in Africa and in the diaspora. And furthermore, Ethiopia played a significant role in Black racial movements. Most importantly, this victory was vital for Ethiopians to keep their tradition and to keep their language, or in promoting their own language. But so if that's the case, you may wonder that if that's the case, why she needs to talk about decolonization. So this is the answer for that. So this non-colonial thesis has been injecting ideas and terminologies such as unique and exceptional into the history of Ethiopian scholarship. So whenever people want to conduct a research on a single area, it's very common for them to come up or to try to understand things from a non-colonial perspective. So, but there has been a very recent scholarly attempts that question this non-colonial thesis, and they have been trying to understand this or re-examine this colonial thesis from a different disciplinary projects. And we can mention Edom Getachew, a very young scholars, to a very senior scholars such as Tashale Tababu and Masai Kabada, and they have been very keen to question or to examine this non-colonial thesis and to try to understand what it means and its implications. So this particular project that I'm working on right now is part of this dialogue, and I'll try my best to understand or to examine this non-colonial thesis from a cultural standpoint by giving a special emphasis to theater or performance. So in order for me to make my argument, I would like to take you on a journey of Ethiopian theater history by giving a special emphasis to the Ethiopian's national theater. So theater was introduced in Ethiopia in 1921, and it was introduced by a young scholar who attended his education abroad. And the reason for him to come up with a Western type of theater was the event that he attended in Ethiopia during that period. So the performance or the event was full of indigenous performances and traditional music. So he thought that Ethiopians were not versed in theater. So he just wanted to teach Ethiopians what theater is and what it's all about. So he just came up with the Western type of theater to teach Ethiopians what theater is all about. So since then, his play has set a tone for the country's consumption of theater. But after 3 decades of theater activities in Ethiopia, the Ethiopia's national theater was established, and I'm just starting. So this is the Ethiopia's national theater. So the reason for its foundation was to stand against cultural imperialism. But unfortunately, the first 10 years of the theater houses were filled with translation plays, and almost all theaters were exclusively directed by white people. But starting from, so these are some of the examples that were performed at the beginning of the national theater. So starting from the 70s to the 90s, the theater Ethiopians took the control. They were actively engaging in performance, but the thing is they were very much active in promoting the Western type of theater, even though most of the plays during that period were governed by the political ideology of that period, which is socialism, but translation plays took a significant place as well. So at the same time, or furthermore, the first theater department in the country played a significant role in accelerating the dissemination of the Western type of theater. Though comparing to the first 10 years of the national theater, this period was not filled with translation plays, but starting from 2000, translation plays have returned back to the national theater. So if we look the last 15 years of production in the national theater, the national theater has put on around 37 productions, and 70 of which were translation, which is half of the productions were translations. And when we say the current situation in the national theater, 5 out of the 8 productions are translation, which is around 64% of the productions in the national theater are translations, which is more, it has more space in the national theater than the original plays. So I'm not here to argue that the Ethiopian National Theater has been slavishly following the Western type of theater, because there were attempts done by the Ethiopian theater, and one of these attempts were just to come up with the idea of promoting indigenous performances in the National Theatre. And the National Theatre established a department called Indigenous Performing Art Research and Training Directorate. But unfortunately, again, for the last 20-something years, only 4 or around 5 theater were performed under this department. So these are some of the examples of the indigenous performances that brought to the Ethiopian National Theatre. So it's called Yekake Wordot. It's a story about a woman who lived 150 years back in Ethiopia who fought for women equality in the society. So this is the other performance that brought to the stage by this department as well. So I'm going to play another short video to give you an idea what I mean when I say like indigenous performances. This one is different in that it was exclusively performed by the local villagers rather than the National Theatre. In fact, it was a collaboration between the National Theatre and an independent theatre company. So as I tried my best to discuss the situation in the National Theatre, the National Theatre has been producing hundreds of theatre for the last 70 years, following the Western type of theatre by giving a special emphasis to the realistic type of theatre. But I'm not here to argue that the National Theatre is not doing its contribution or contributing to the development of Ethiopia for Ethiopia theater. But the thing is, we all know that in majority of African countries, the Western type of theater or Western entertainment forms coexist with African indigenous performances. So the thing is, in Ethiopia, like in non-colonial country, the presence or the significant presence of Western type of theater occupies a paradoxical, space that is neither intimate nor distance. So the question is, how are we going to question this non-colonial thesis in order for us to move forward and to present ourselves in our space? So here, my conclusion is, I think it's time for us to recognize the problems and to begin the decolonization process. When I say, let's decolonize our theater, I simply say, let's see ourselves in our stage rather than giving a special emphasis to the Western type of theater or rather than relying on the Western type of theater. I think it's time for us to present ourselves in our national stage. Thank you so much. This is the agro. So before leaving the floor, I just want to take this opportunity to thank my Professor Freda Ikota and Molade Teyi Marwa and my court, and at the same time my home institution, which is Addis Ababa University.
Thank you very much. You guys should please come up. So from colorectal cancer to consumer protection and now decolonization of theaters in Ethiopia. So it's time for questions. We need the mic. So can you check online? Do we have anyone ready to ask a question? And while we're waiting for the mic, five questions. Okay, can I access it yet?
Questions?
Yeah.
I'll pull them up.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Mara, can you take the mic, please? No, I'm going to read it from, no, I can't say it yet. Not yet. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, that's them right there.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, thanks. All right, so the first question is what caused the colonization of Ethiopian theater? And here is how we're going to proceed. Yeah, and note down the questions. We'll take a couple of questions, then we'll let you respond. And we keep going as long as we still have more time. So, Dr. Okoye, amazing work. I'm glad you mentioned the peptic ulcer to CRC progression. Are there any known causes of peptic ulcer in the African patient populations? Then the second question, any reason speculated for why right-sided colon cancer is more aggressive? Are there any additional therapies to CRC besides chemo? Then to Dr. Tshepiso, why was Michigan's CPA the chosen comparative? Are there African countries with established CPAs? I was going to ask that question, actually. Why Michigan and why the United States and India? Dr. Tshepiso, how can one strike a balance between protecting consumers and facilitating the free market to thrive? Some people suggest that there is a conflict between the two. What are your thoughts? And lastly, there is one about decolonization. Okay, what caused colonization of Ethiopian theater? So why don't we take those questions? I'll start with Jude. And please, those online, keep your questions coming.
Okay, thank you. That's an interesting question. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, so one of the questions stated or asked, any known cause of peptic ulcer? Well, there are several reasons or several attributable factors to peptic ulcer, where we believe that peptic ulcer could arise due to starvation. A whole lot of people undergo fasting, unregulated fasting, and that induces this peptic ulcer. So we advise people to regulate the rate of fasting in order to prevent this. And we believe that other factors could be responsible, just like these carbonated drinks.
Your mic is not working.
Okay, so we believe that carbonated drinks as well could increase the risk of this peptic ulcer. So we should regulate it, especially when the person has been fasting over a period of time. Taking this carbonated drink immediately, on empty stomach could increase the risk of this peptic ulcer. So the right-sided colon cancer, no particular factor has been associated with right-sided colon cancer, but we believe that age may be a contributing factor to the right-sided colon cancer. And again, we also believe that some mutations, and that is why we want to carry out this study, that this study will help us reveal the mutations that are associated with this right-sided colon cancer. And if we can find that, we'll be able to monitor this individual and maybe prevent or forestall the development of this right-sided colon cancer. Then, is there any additional therapy to chemotherapy? Well, none has been proven to be that effective than chemotherapy, though that we observe resistance among our patients. But right now, chemotherapy is
it's affordable. And then we have the immunotherapy as well. Immunotherapy is quite effective, but the cost of immunotherapy is quite, I think, maybe 5 times higher than the chemotherapy. So, and that cannot be, adopted in Africa where poverty is kind of high. So, thank you.
All right, thank you. Dr. Tshepiso Scott.
All right, thank you for the questions. Thank you for the questions. Is my mic on?
Yeah.
All right. So far as the first question is concerned around why Michigan, why not any African countries, I intentionally wanted to look at 2 developed countries and 2 developing countries for purposes of this particular comparative research, because I wanted to see if I could draw any analogies insofar as economic development and its impact on the approach to consumer protection in a particular jurisdiction. I did find these analogies insofar as the developing countries leaning more towards protecting their consumers, following more of a social and interventionist approach, whereas the developed countries tended to be more in favor of a autonomous approach, a contractual autonomous approach, which follows the classical theory of contract. So I'm still trying to couch how exactly I'm going to frame that in my paper, because that is an analogy that is drawn subject to some serious limitations, because I've only compared 4 countries here. It's not like I've looked at a number of developed and developing countries against each other, but I did want to see whether there could be any analogies drawn in that regard. Then why not another African country as a developing country? So as at the time that I initiated this research is actually a sub-theme from something that arose, from the research that I was conducting while finalizing my thesis. At that time, there was no other African country that had a comprehensive and long-standing consumer protection framework. So India seemed to be the best option I had at that time, because even though the act I've referred to in my presentation is a 2019 act, it had an act in 1986 already on consumer protection. So as a developing country, it seemed to have made enough strides in the space of consumer protection for me to be able to make proper comparisons. And that's why I ended up choosing India. Then how can one strike a balance between protecting on the one side and then allowing for a free market on the other side? And also reference there to some people suggesting that there are tensions. Yes, indeed, there are tensions. I've tried to also mention them at the beginning of my presentation, insofar as there is this tension. Even in the South African context, there was this tension between the classical approach to contract, where you allow contracting parties to be free, autonomous individuals that make up their own minds and bear their own consequences. Whereas on the other side, there's the more fairness-orientated approach. Even our own courts, after the Constitution was enacted, were very reluctant to self-impose fairness into contracts. And they still stuck to a more classical theory of contract that promoted self-autonomy in contractual arrangements, which is why it was important for us to have a consumer protection legislation. So in my view, I think that the balance has, to a certain degree, been struck with the Consumer Protection Act that's currently applicable in South Africa, because that's exactly what it seeks to do. It is addressing fairness where fairness needs to be addressed. It's not unnecessarily imposing on contractual arrangements in all commercial engagements, only in commercial engagements where there are consumers who are the parties who are considered to have an unequal bargaining position or who don't have equal access to information or knowledge.
Okay, thank you. Eyerusaleam?
Yeah. Thank you so much for the question. A simple or a short answer but for the question of what causes decolonization is we as an Ethiopian took our non-colonial past for granted. So whenever I have a conversation with people who come from a theater background or a theater professor, they simply act as if we don't have any influence that comes from the West. So we usually romanticize that we're not colonized, but we're not conscious about the neo-colonial activities that's happening in Ethiopia. So we usually, or theater practitioners and scholars have acknowledged openly the deeply embedded notions of uniqueness and exceptional. In my opinion, that doesn't make the situation in Ethiopia any different or any easier than other African countries. So in my opinion, it's one of the issues that prevented Ethiopia from questioning the presence of Western on performance and theater. So I think it's time for us to question the non-colonial thesis, or to use that non-colonial thesis for, in order for us to move forward rather than holding us backward.
All right, thank you very much. Questions, guys?
Thank you guys so much. I loved all of your presentations. I have 2 questions for Okoye. First, when you were talking about different treatments, you mentioned the herbal concoction and how it had decent effects at first. And I was wondering, when you refer to an herbal concoction, is there a standard concoction or at least a standard herb that is used that could be having these positive effects? And then my second question is, you also mentioned the westernization of food systems as a potential causation of rising rates of CRC. Is that from westernized foods being processed, or because higher sodium rates? What is that causation, and how could that better be regulated in order to control rising rates of CRC?
Okay.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Anifat, and I'm a faculty from Nigeria. So I think I can relate with Jude. And my question to Jude is, I understand that you can relate with patients under chemo at the hospital or clinic. How do you discover those that are using herbals? How do you collect your data for the people that are using herbal therapy?
Okay, so we've got a couple of questions online. There is one for Eyerusaleam. Would you please elaborate on the role of academics and theater professionals in Ethiopia in promoting the Western form of theater rather than the indigenous forms? And then there is the question about what is the cause of the underwhelming indigenous performances in a theater that was established purposely to promote it? And again, how can we decolonize theater performances in Africa and Ethiopia specifically? So I'll start with Tshepiso this time. Oh,
I don't have a question.
no question for you, sorry.
Questions for me. Yeah.
Okay, Jude, go ahead.
Okay, thank you for that interesting question about the particular type of herb used by the patients or our people. Actually, that's why it's called a concussion. There's no specific herb. They throw in whatever they believe, all herb, cure, or whatever they think that could, lend or help or alleviate the condition of the patient. They just throw it together, and that forms a concussion. And then if it works, they are happy. If it doesn't work, so there's no standard herb, so to speak. Then what I mean by westernization of food, of the African diet, is that most of these food that we now consume are processed. They eat a lot of processed food, and then they do a lot of microwaving. Back in the days, we do not do much of this microwaving, and research has shown that the microwaving of food decreases the micronutrients in the food, and that could also increase the risk of someone developing cancer. So, and there are several factors. Then how do we discover, from Hanifat, how do we discover the patients that have been using herbs? Well, we use questionnaire-based, interview-based questionnaire survey to get those who have been using these herbs. But I would like to add that some of these patients lie when they don't want to tell you that
they have been using, so that you don't, send them away that you've been using, go and continue using that. So they sometimes lie, but what can we do? You only accept what they give you and then work on what the data that you have. So we ask them and then get the information from them directly. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Before Eyerusaleam, just one question for Tshepiso. Are there common practices by African consumers as regards protection? So this will come after Eyerusaleam responds to the question. Are you aware of any consumer protection practices by other African countries? I guess that's the question the person is trying to ask. So, but Eyerusaleam.
So thank you so much again for the question. So as an instructor who has been teaching theater and cinema in Ethiopia, I think one of the problems that I have been grappling with is like, am I going to teach a Western type of theater for years to come? Because it's been very difficult for me to teach indigenous performances that are happening or that are, Thank you. So indigenous performances, because when we start teaching theater, the first thing that we do is like encouraging students to learn more about the Western type of theater. So helping them to understand the terminologies that comes from the Western and trying to give them a criteria so that they're going to use them whenever they see performances in theater plays in theater houses. So after that, it's gonna be difficult for them to entertain indigenous performances, because whenever they just see indigenous performances, the only thing that comes to the first thing that comes to their mind is the criteria that we gave them at their first year. So I think the first thing that we need to do is, as an instructor and as a university, is to decolonize our curriculum. And so whenever I started teaching my students, the first thing that I will do is I will try to give reading lists that starts from Africa, rather than giving them books that are going to talk about Western theater, so that it's going to be easy for them to listen or to read plays that comes from Africa, or to read plays or to like appreciate Wole Soyinka or Watiengo rather than Shakespeare. I'm not saying Shakespeare is bad, but I think it's very important for us to open spaces for all kind of knowledge rather than concentrating on the dominant knowledge that comes from the Western. So in order for us to decolonize our theater generally in Africa and in Ethiopia, at least the first thing that we need to do is encouraging people to start learning from their lived experience, rather than like imposing ideas that come from the Western and letting them evaluate everything based on that criteria. So I think I just answered both the questions together.
Thank you. Tshepiso?
Insofar as my awareness around other consumer protection measures in other African countries, in a recent conference I attended, I came across colleagues from Kenya who did make reference to some consumer protection legislation in Kenya. I haven't looked into it, so I can't speak authoritatively on that point, but I do think that Africa is definitely in the process of developing its own consumer protection frameworks in various countries. But yeah, I haven't looked into it enough to be able to speak authoritatively on it.
All right, thank you. So we have time for maybe one or two more questions before we close. And I've got one hand here, Ebenezer.
Hi. Yeah, my question is for Eyerusaleam. Are you looking at some samples within Africa of countries that have successfully implemented like local theater within like their general theater system? Because I know that Nigeria is like one strong example of that, and I think like there might be like other like examples within the continent, which is what you like in doing your own research. Like, are there these like intracontinental samples you are looking at?
Mm-hmm. One more question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry. Anyone? All right, please. Okay. Professor Nriagu there.
Yeah, this one is for Jude. You know, the two basic causes of cancer are the environment and genes. In your study, have you tried to look at the relative contributions of either the environment or the gene to the CRC, the colorectal cancer that you're working on?
Okay, thank you. Any other? All right, we'll start with Eyerusaleam.
Thank you for the question. Since I didn't do any comparison between amongst African countries, I might not give you a lot of examples, but based on my readings, I would say that Kenya has been doing great in terms of like promoting indigenous performances, and I would like to mention here the community theater that has been chaired by Ngugi wa Thiong'o. But I know that most African countries have been trying a lot to incorporate indigenous performances in their theater activities because they are aware that the Western type of theater is controlling the continent, and they're conscious and they are very much keen to resist that power by producing indigenous performances actively.
Thank you. Jude.
Yes, thank you, Professor, for that question. Yes, we know that cancer could emanate from or stem from various factors, especially the environment and the gene, inherited genes. Yes, and that is why this study is quite important. We intend to identify the genes that are responsible for this development of cancer, especially in elderly individuals. And then we also, we are not at the moment looking at the environmental factors, but I know that a colleague back at home is looking at the distribution of this cancer across the state, and then to identify whether maybe lead or cadmium or arsenic is a contributing factor. But for sure, you can't tie cancer to a particular thing. You may find maybe a toxicant in an environment, and you still see that those people are not coming up or developing cancer. So a whole lot of factors come together to make an individual susceptible to the development of cancer. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, everyone. We've come to the end of today's colloquium, and just a quick announcement. The last in the series of our colloquium will be taking place next week, same time, here, Thursday, and we hope to see all of you here again. And just a note of appreciation to my colleagues who put together all of the events for our UMAPS scholars, Marwa Hassan, Teye Pam, and Andres Kwaze. Thank you for all of the good work that you do for the ASC, and of course, backroom staff that our UMAPS scholars and others don't see often, but they are also part of our team, Kari Covert, as well as Gloria Cordil. So they work behind the scene to make all of our programs successful, so we appreciate them. And of course, our Monga Fatu, who keeps our UMAPS scholars happy in Monga, so we appreciate that too. So thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon, and please join us for a reception and interaction with our scholars. So please, let's give our hands together, put our hands together for that excellent evening.